What historic fact keeps you awake at night? Story 1. The Bronze Age collapsed. Around 3,200 years ago, nearly all ancient civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East region were wiped out in a widespread event/societal collapse that was likely sudden and violent and followed by the Greek Dark Ages, and nobody really knows what happened. It just blows my mind. Story 2. The Webb telescope has the power to see up to 13.5 billion light-years away. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. That means the Webb telescope is taking pictures of things that happened 9 billion years before the Earth even existed. Story 3. How little of human history was recorded or survived the ages? Modern humans have been around 300,000 years. Recorded history only goes back to the 4th to 5th millennium BCE. Uncounted humans lived, loved, suffered, created, and died for 60-70x the time of all recorded history. How little of human history was recorded or survived the ages? Modern humans have been around 300,000 years. Recorded history only goes back to the 4th to 5th millennium before the Common Era. Uncounted humans lived, loved, suffered, created, and died for 60-70x the time of all recorded history. Most of human history has no record at all, and civilization is only 12,000 odd years old. This is all just a tiny blip so far, and yet there are an estimated 1,600x more people alive right now than there were when recorded history began around 5000 BCE. At that time, it's estimated that around 8 to 9 billion people had ever lived, about the same as the number of people alive today. In terms of cumulative human consciousness, there is about the same amount of lived experience happening right now than in all of the combined 200,000 years of human history before written records existed. Even if they had written everything down from the beginning, it would probably pale in comparison to the amount of human experience being documented every year on the internet. Story 4. I'm blown away by the early mathematics that was achieved by guys who were literally inventing the concepts. Math is so freaking cool because you can derive the crazy stuff from basic principles. If you start with just the numbers 0 and 1, you can, by knowing what kinds of operations you want to do, like addition, subtraction, squaring, etc., derive all the sets of numbers, real, complex, rational, etc. Story 5. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it's an interesting fact. The oldest person alive right now is 116 years and some days. That means that 117 years ago, every single person on this planet was different. In other words, a whole new set of people are here. 117 years was not that long ago. The death of Lincoln was recent enough to where a man who witnessed it appeared on TV. We really don't have a very good grasp on time when it comes to counting years. IIRC were only a few generations away from the American Civil War, and that was 160 years ago. If your great-great-grandparents were still alive, they could probably tell you stories from that time. Story 6. The fact that human civilization only still exists because one Soviet naval officer disobeyed a direct order to fire a nuke at the US. It wasn't disobedience. As per Soviet doctrine at that time, the launch of nuclear warheads required the consent of the captain and political officer on board. Just by luck, that one particular submarine happened to host a flotilla admiral as well, meaning that 3 instead of the usual 2 votes were required. The captain and political officer already voted yes. Vasily Arkhipov simply used his judgment to prevent catastrophe. Story 7. Major electric companies including GE and Philips got together in the 1920s to form the Phoebus cartel so that they could agree to intentionally lower the lifespan of light bulbs. We had the technology for long-lasting light bulbs. Profit-chasing execs said, nah, let's create low-quality products so we can cash in. What else are we keeping from ourselves? Story 8. This is so niche, but every time I get on a Mary Queen of Scots reading kick, I get re-obsessed with the death of Darnley. It's essentially unsolvable at this point, but everybody involved is acting so weird. The short version is that Mary and her husband Darnley are in a tense, unhappy marriage. He's staying at a house, she's staying at a castle somewhat nearby. She visits him at one point that night, then leaves to do other social stuff. He stays. The house exploded due to a ton of gunpowder in the cellar that didn't really have a good reason to be there. Mary is fine. She's far from the site. The servant who was still in the house dies, apparently looking like you would expect somebody to look who was in a giant explosion. Darnley, however, is found dead some distance away, partially dressed and apparently strangled. based on Tudor-era forensics, so who knows? Another servant is found with him and is in a similar condition, half-naked, strangled. It's kind of like the John Bennett Ramsey case in that there are a lot of theories that explain about 95% of the facts while still leaving a few key elements out to bother you. If Mary knew about the plot, would she have risked visiting the house after it was full of gunpowder? If she didn't, was she supposed to be a target as well? Did Darnley figure something out and make a run for it, or was he in the orchard just because he got thrown there in the explosion and the people who examined him assumed he was strangled because they hadn't seen many people die from having their internal organs liquefied by a huge explosion? Was he half-naked because he woke up in the middle of the night and started running, or because explosions can rip clothing off people? There were trials and confessions, but they were highly political, and the interrogation methods of the time were pretty aggressive. It's all just very strange and complicated, and it always sticks in my mind. What was supposed to happen? What actually happened? History could have gone so differently if Darnley had lived or Mary had died that night. Story 9. I will never forgive Spain for destroying the codices of the huge indigenous empires. So much history lost for a parasite of an empire, and most of those by one priest. I'm reading a book about some modern Mayans in Central America, and the author describes some U.S. Catholic priest who showed up and knocked over and burned a bunch of their religious stuff in the 1960s to try and stamp out indigenous beliefs. Catholic priests can suck it. The most they ever do for colonized areas is put band-aids on the bullet holes the church helps put in indigenous societies. Story 10. The pale blue dot image from Voyager 1. It shows the Earth as a tiny speck. Basically, all of the amazing and horrible things that have ever happened in Earth's history occurred inside this tiny speck in the unbelievably massive universe. Story 11, that there was an entire civilization across the US and we just showed up like, this is ours. Or that almost all of us can recall when our ancestors came to the US, Ireland, England, Europe somewhere, yet we treat new immigrants in modern times like they're looking for something different than our ancestors were. Story 12. A prehistory fact that keeps me awake. The Permian extinction event, the worst extinction ever, has many metrics that are comparable to today. Increased atmospheric CO2, climate change, acidic rain, etc. At current rates, we are speedrunning it. And we also have humans in the mix, a species that is really good at whatever they are motivated to achieve. And the main motivator in the end is IMHO short-term survival like all other animals. Story 13. In the midst of one of the world wars, in the dark of the night in Istanbul, a group of Greek soldiers accompanied a Greek Orthodox priest on a mission to break into Hagia Sophia and celebrate an Orthodox liturgy. Not only that, but they snuck out afterwards and nobody knew until later when the priest and soldiers told the story. Story 14. The fact that nearly 10 times the amount of Native Americans were decimated by pioneers in America than in Germany. Not to take away from that atrocity, it's horrendous, and nobody even talks about it, nor is it typically taught to humans just how many Native Americans were murdered intentionally. Story 15. Several 100,000 years ago, the entire human population was reduced to less than 2,000 individuals. We were scarily close to extinction, and by human, I mean every species in the genus Homo, not just us sapiens. Professor Chris Stringer, an expert in human evolution from the Natural History Museum who reviewed the paper, says, during the period of the bottleneck, there are a number of sites that record evidence of human occupation. This could mean that there wasn't a bottleneck, but could equally mean it only had a localized impact on part of the human population. Sounds to me like this is more a theory than anything else. Quite interesting though. Story 16. We don't know a damn thing about what the gods and myths of the people who first inhabited England are, and we likely never will. The Scots, Welsh, and Irish have their own myths and legends that have survived and passed down. But what is now England was battered so much over the years by Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and French invasions that there is little to nothing left of what was there originally. It's why Stonehenge is such a big deal to England. It looks like a pile of rocks to most, but it's one of the few things left of those forgotten people. We know it to be a shrine or an altar, but to what ancient gods we'll never know. I find that rather sad. Story 17. I'm very into the Eastern Roman Empire, and I think endlessly about the fall of Constantinople. Fire raining from the sky, the 1,000-year-old Theodosian walls crumbling, the fact that Europe didn't send aid to Constantinople because it had been there and prosperous so long that they figured it would be fine without, the fact that it was the tail end of an extremely long-lived society that literally defined the Mediterranean region. I have a lot of thoughts about this, but the big ones that it boils down to are as follows. Due to all of this, it had to have felt like the end of the world to the residents of Constantinople during the fall of 1453. So much of the information about it makes reading about it feel more like I'm reading an epic fantasy novel rather than about actual historical events. Between the fact that, as I said, I imagine it probably felt like the end of the world based on the information available and all the historical context, the fact that Emperor Constantine the Palaiologos chose to die fighting for his empire rather than surrender and live, and the legend of the Marble Emperor just kicks it up a notch. For those unfamiliar with the legend of the Marble Emperor, in the years after the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, a legend spread that Constantine the Palaiologos, the emperor who died in battle fighting for his empire, had not actually died but was saved moments before death by an angel who turned him to marble and hidden under the Golden Gate of Constantinople. There, he is said to await a call from God to reawaken and restore the empire. This is just one of many Eastern Roman Empire stories that make me wish more fantasy took inspiration from the eerie in aesthetics, politics, and little historical anecdotes like this. Story 18, Permafrost Ice, allows us to track human history fairly accurately. We know when silver mines were shut down and the level of manufacturing in societies just by how much CO2 and other particles are in the layers. Another one is that the Roman Empire was so influential that, from space, you can see how the cities with the most light pollution in Europe can help form the accurate borders of the Roman Empire relative to their neighbors. Story 19. Before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Rome had running water in public fountains and baths available to all. Rich Romans had running water in their houses. This was more than 2,000 years ago. After the fall, Europe forgot how to do this, and it was more than 1,000 years before they figured it out again. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Chinese fleet of Admiral Zheng He had the ability to sail any ocean in the world, and they could have attacked anywhere if they wished. They preferred exploration and trade. This was before Columbus. For political reasons, advisors to the emperor convinced him to burn the fleet. Within a century, shipbuilders lost the ability to create ocean-going ships. The Chinese Navy didn't recover until recently. The Chinese could have colonized the world before the Europeans, but they didn't because of silly parochial issues. It is very possible for history to stop progressing and for things to get considerably worse. We can lose knowledge that took our brightest people decades or even centuries to create. There is no guarantee that things will be better in the future. I worry that we may be headed into just such a period where we lose a lot because of our inability to see what is best for everyone versus what is best for me. Story 20, Postmortem Photography. Families in Victorian England often took photos with recently deceased relatives as mementos, sometimes painting up their faces, securing, sometimes but not often, their bodies in sitting positions using clamps and pulleys, and even drawing on their pupils to look alive. And yes, a lot of these photos are on Google. Story 21, all of it. Human history is filled with examples of brutality. Imagine living in an English seaport, South American village, Chinese village, or a frontier settlement, unsure about whether the Vikings, Aztecs, Mongols, or Comanche, respectively, were going to sweep through in the night and destroy your entire livelihood. The more I learn about history, the more appreciative I am to have been alive during modern times. Story 22. The Albigensian Crusade should be ranked amongst the absolute worst crimes ever committed in history. Do you know that the Inquisition is synonymous with torture and zealotry? Meet her cradle. The amount of misery, tragedy, destruction, death, and suffering that were inflicted on the south of France as a whole and on the Cathars specifically, not to mention the Jewish people, is just unspeakable. It was a genocide, pure and simple, and I'm not one saying that. Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word, did. Sure, there were political matters at hand. The southern nobles sure liked to rebel, but not once was the violence not center stage. The political stuff generally happened around the brutality. Massacres were politically motivated or religiously motivated, and more often than not both, but they were always around. Do you know what pisses me off the most about it all? Cathars were pacifists. They didn't resist. They refused to bear arms. Even when they were besieged, they often did not take part in the fighting. Montségur, I think. Even if you buy into the narrative that they were the worst thing to ever exist since mold on bread, the level of savagery employed was completely unnecessary. Like Bezier's wasn't an answer to anything equivalent or even near it. It didn't need to happen whatsoever. Do you know why it did? Because there were people like Arnaud Amalric, a Catholic priest and papal legate, holding the reins. When asked how should the soldiers know who was okay to kill once Bezier's was breached, he said, and I quote, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Some doubt the words were actually said, but this should give you an idea of what the mindset was back then and of what was done to people. On the same note, the Rhineland pogroms that preceded the First Crusade. If there is a hell, I hope Peter the Hermit and Emiko of Leiningen are rotting in its darkest pit. Story 23. One of the rooms of Hausen Inn, a temple in Kyoto, features a blood-stained ceiling that was originally a floor piece from Fushimi Castle. The blood is from Torimoto Tada, Tokugawa Ieyasu's retainer, and several other men who committed seppuku when the castle they were garrisoned in was being overrun by Ishida Mitsunari's forces during the siege of Fushimi Castle. Story 24. The Inca Empire was so vast and long, and we don't really have that much of their history. We can't decipher their knot language, and we have only found parts of the empire. I'm sure there's much more lost to time and forest overgrowth. They were geniuses. The stuff they managed to pull off agriculturally is mind-blowing alone. Story 25. I don't know if this is a historical fact, but it's amazing and kinda of scary to think that life began on Earth 3.7 billion years ago. There have been hundreds of millions of different species, and only humans have created a society like ours. Really makes you wonder if this is all natural, or if humans are a weird exception from what life is supposed to be. Story 26. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. It was equivalent to a 200 megaton nuke, almost 4 times as powerful as the strongest nuke ever created. It erupted for 5 months straight, killed anywhere from 36,000 to 120,000 people, and destroyed entire islands, along with their entire populations. The climax of the eruption was so violent it was heard up to 3,000 miles away, and the pressure wave of the sonic blast circled the Earth 3 times. At 100 miles away, the blast was still as loud as a shotgun fired point blank. Nature doesn't play around. Story 27. When Napoleon Bonaparte spent a night all alone in the pyramids of Giza, then he sought something. Afterward, out of his breath and covered in sweat, he ran away from there to the outside. People came by and said in wonder, "What happened?" He paused just as he was about to tell, and he continued, "You wouldn't believe me. It may be a rumor or not, but there are many things that we haven't heard, seen, experienced. Those are the things that keep me awake at night, besides my own life." Story 28. Okay, so bear with me. During FDR's 3rd term, a guy most people never heard of, Henry Wallace, was his VP. He was extremely progressive. That's why the party heads didn't like him. Using party shenanigans, the bosses got him moved off the ticket and replaced with Harry Truman. So when FDR died in April, had Wallace remained on the ticket in that last term, I think for one, I'm not sure he would have authorized nuking Japan, and I'm not sure the Cold War would have played out anywhere near the same. Finally, New Deal-style policy would have continued into the 1950s. The entire trajectory of the United States in the second half of the 20th century would have been different. Story 29. One man literally stopped World War II from happening because he kept a clear head in a potentially dire situation. Stanislav Petrov, as a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Petrov was on duty September 26, 1983, when the early warning satellite system he was monitoring detected what appeared to be 5 approaching U.S. nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles. Petrov was faced with a critical choice that had to be made immediately: treat the warning as a false alarm or alert his superiors, who likely would launch a counterattack. Petrov went with a false alarm, later explaining he reasoned that if the United States really were to start a nuclear war, it would do so with more than 5 missiles. He was correct. Story 30. We don't actually know how Rome was made. All accounts of how it was made say a pregnant woman gave birth to twins in the woods, and then she either died or abandoned them. With no parents, the twins had been raised by female wolves. Once they become teenagers, the teens raised by wolves decide to take over the world. The two overthrew some kingdoms, and the two realized the other might overthrow the other's kingdom, so one twin killed the other and unified the kingdoms, renaming it Rome. Story 31, best put by Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I'll do my best to relay. The rate at which our universe is expanding is increasing, and this rate will continue to increase forever, as far as we know. Due to this ever-accelerating expansion, light will eventually be unable to reach our local cluster, Us and Andromeda, from other galaxies and stars. In billions of years in a future Milkdromeda, the night sky surrounding our galactic cluster will be completely blank. From Earth, you would look up and only see the other stars and bodies with our newly combined galaxies and nothing else. Without these other stars and black holes and nebulae, etc., we would not have been able to learn about the Big Bang, the start of our universe. Future citizens of Milkdromeda, if their civilization was born after these stars had disappeared from our view, would never be able to learn about this fundamental history of our universe. They would not believe that there was anything other than themselves and Milkdromeda, the part that keeps me up at night. What has already disappeared from our night sky? What are we missing when we look at the universe that was ripped from our view, gone for eternity? Story 32, it's sort of trite because it gets repeated ad nauseum, but we really do not understand how the Great Pyramid was completed. The argument is it was done with highly skilled workers over the course of 30 years. If this is the case, there is very little evidence the workers with bronze chisels or perhaps flint, which is better, and saws cut over 2 million blocks that weigh between 280 tons that we know for certain came from 500 miles away. The workers required may be over 30,000 constantly working 24/7 for 30 years, not including the training, food, and logistics people to supply said workforce, and also ignoring the need for a military which is typically this level of cost historically and currently. This number 3,000 is roughly over 3% of the entire population of Egypt at the time. This level of logistics rivals the modern U.S. entire military in logistical effort and cost to a society of GDP. The cost would almost certainly be orders of magnitude larger for a time period using bronze saws on granite. Tests have been done, and basic timing and math do not make sense. Just building the Great Pyramid, let alone the other ones, would require nearly an entire society dedicated to one task for multiple generations. There is a massive knowledge gap missing for how that was accomplished. This would be an insane accomplishment by the richest nations today with far more resources and larger populations. Frankly, solving this problem would benefit the entire human race for multiple possible reasons. Story 33. By the winter of 1942, the whole city of Stalingrad was surrounded by the massed Sixth Army. It was pressing and pressing. The Russians couldn't hold on much longer. Many wanted to submit, but the German supply lines were stretched, Zhukov countered, and the siege was broken. And that's all the story of Stalingrad.